The winter of 1888 came down on the Dakota Territories like a hammer on cold iron. It was not a season that crept in with gentle frosts and painterly colors. It was an invasion. The wind, born on the frozen plains of the north, arrived without announcement, a vast and invisible beast that scoured the land, stripping the last stubborn leaves from the cottonwoods and leaving the prairie grasses brittle as bone. The cold did not knock before it entered. It seeped through the thickest logs, it breathed through the smallest cracks, and it laid its icy hand upon everything. For the settlers in the small, unnamed valley, carved by the whims of a shallow creek, this was the great proving ground. They were hardy people, no strangers to hardship, but this cold was different. It was personal. It was a predator. Their cabins, built with the sweat of summer and the pride of self-reliance, became frigid traps. The cast-iron stoves, monuments of progress shipped all the way from the east, were insatiable gods that demanded a constant sacrifice of wood. They roared day and night, their iron sides glowing a dull cherry red. Yet the heat they produced was a fleeting, desperate thing. It rose, thin and useless, to gather in the rafters, while the floors remained cold enough to numb the feet through 2 pairs of wool socks. Drafts moved through the cabins like thieves in the night. They came from the floorboards, from the window frames, from the very heart of the mud and moss chinking that was supposed to seal them from the elements. Frost grew on the inside of the walls, delicate and beautiful patterns of lethal ice. A cup of water left on a table overnight would be a solid block by morning. Families huddled together, wrapped in every blanket and quilt they owned, their lives shrinking to the small circle of warmth immediately surrounding the hungry stove. They burned through their wood piles with alarming speed, watching the carefully stacked cords of oak and ash diminish with each passing day. The men would spend their daylight hours in the biting wind, axes ringing against frozen wood, their breath pluming in the air, only to haul back loads that seemed to vanish into smoke and cinders within hours. The problem was universal. It was not a failure of a single man, but a failure of their collective wisdom. Silas Blackwood, a man whose hands were as broad and calloused as oak planks, was considered the best builder in the valley. His own cabin, the tightest and proudest of them all, was just as cold as the rest. He had followed the proven ways, the methods passed down and trusted. He had laid his foundation true, squared his logs with an expert eye, and chinked the gaps until not a sliver of daylight could be seen. Yet the cold still came for him. It came for everyone. The community was bound together by a shared, shivering misery, a testament to the fact that their known world of knowledge had met its match. In this valley of struggling experts, there was one who was considered anything but. Elara, a widow for 2 years, lived at the slight curve of the creek where the valley began to narrow. She was quiet and kept to herself, a fact that the others mistook for fragility. They saw a woman alone with a young son, Samuel, and they saw a tragedy waiting to happen. Her husband had been a strange man, an engineer from the old country, with a mind full of diagrams and theories that had no place on the practical frontier. He had left behind a small collection of books filled with dense text and strange drawings, and it was these that Elara now consulted by candlelight. When she began construction on her small cabin that summer, the men had offered their help, as was the custom. She thanked them politely but declined, explaining that she had her own design to follow. The design, they soon saw, was peculiar. It was smaller than most, and she spent an inordinate amount of time on the foundation, laying a bed of stone and gravel that seemed excessive. Silas, stopping by one afternoon, watched her for a while before shaking his head. "That's a waste of stone, ma'am," he'd said, his voice a low rumble of authority. "The ground is hard here. You only need footings." Elara had only smiled faintly and continued her work. The true strangeness began when the walls were up. The men of the valley were preparing to install their new stoves, positioning them in the center of their main rooms for maximum heat distribution. They waited for Ilara to ask for help moving a heavy iron stove into her own cabin, but the request never came. Instead, she began hauling clay from the creek bed, bucket by painstaking bucket. She mixed it with sand and dried grass, her small frame straining with the effort of turning the thick mixture with a spade. Samuel, his face smudged with dirt, helped by carrying water. The community watched this activity with growing bewilderment. She was building something inside the cabin, against the main interior wall. It was a large, bench-like structure, a serpentine mass of clay and stone that took up a significant portion of the small room. "What in God's name is that thing?" one man asked Silas as they watched from a distance. Silas squinted, his brow furrowed in disapproval. "Looks like she's building an oven. Inside. A baker's oven." The idea was so absurd that the other man chuckled. "She'll burn herself out of house and home before the first snow." The laughter started then. It wasn't cruel, not at first. It was the easy, confident laughter of people who knew the right way to do things, watching someone who clearly did not. They called it her mud pile, her clay mountain. The children, picking up on their parents' talk, would sometimes run past her claim, chanting, "Ms. Ilara's building a mud pie." Ilara heard them. She saw the men shaking their heads as they rode past, but she never stopped working. Her face, set in lines of quiet determination, was focused only on the task at hand. Her husband had shown her the drawings, explained the principles. Heat was a living thing, he'd said. An iron stove shouted its heat, and most of it was lost in the shouting. This mass of earth, would be different. It would listen to the fire. It would hold its heat like a secret and whisper it back into the room all day long. Silas finally decided he had to intervene. He was a good man, and he felt a responsibility. He walked over to her cabin one evening as the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the valley. Ilara was smoothing the final layer of clay plaster onto the bench. "Ma'am," Silas began, removing his hat, "I don't mean to pry, but I can't stand by and watch you and the boy head into winter like this. There's no stove here. That thing, it's not safe. A fire inside a mud chimney is liable to crack it and set the whole cabin ablaze. At best, it'll fill the room with smoke. You'll suffocate." Ilara looked up at him. Her hands were caked in dry clay. "It's not a chimney, Mr. Blackwood," she said, her voice soft but steady. "The chimney is behind it, in the wall. This is the heat catcher." She pointed to a small iron door at the base of the structure. "The fire goes in here. It's very small, very hot. The smoke travels through a long channel inside the bench before it goes out. The mud and stone hold the heat from the smoke. The bench warms the room." Silas stared at the contraption. It made no sense. Everyone knew you needed a big fire to fight a big cold. Everyone knew smoke went straight up a chimney. "That's foolishness," he said, the words coming out sharper than he intended. "That's book nonsense. It won't work in a real winter. You need a proper stove. I have a spare one, a small Franklin. I can have the boys help me bring it over tomorrow." It was a generous offer, an act of charity meant to save her from her own folly. "Thank you, Silas," she replied, her gaze unwavering. "But I will trust my husband's design." The finality in her tone left no room for argument. He was dismissed. Silas put his hat back on, his face a mask of frustration and pity. "Don't say I didn't warn you," he muttered as he walked away. The story of his offer and her refusal spread through the valley, cementing her status as a stubborn fool. The laughter became less gentle. Now it was tinged with a grim certainty. They were watching a woman willfully endanger herself and her child, and their pity was curdling into resentment. They were all in this together, and she was breaking the rules. The work was isolating. The sun rose and set, and Ilara's world was the weight of a stone, the texture of wet clay, the ache in her lower back. She rose before dawn, while the air was still and sharp, and began by mixing the cob. Her hands, which had once been soft, were now a map of calluses, cracks, and ingrained dirt. She learned the language of her materials. She learned that too much water made the clay slump, and too little made it crack as it dried. She learned the satisfying thud of a well-seated fieldstone, and the precise angle needed for the flue channels to draw the smoke without stealing all its heat. She was building more than a heater. She was building a machine of survival, and every part had to be perfect. The firebox was small and square, lined with firebrick she had painstakingly chipped to size. This was where the combustion would happen, hot and fast, to burn the wood so completely that little smoke or creosote would be produced. From there, the hot gases would travel into a vertical metal pipe, the heat riser, which was then insulated with a mixture of perlite and clay to get it fantastically hot. This was the engine of the whole system. After the riser, the gases would be directed downward and into the labyrinth of channels that snaked through the massive earthen bench. This was the part that baffled the onlookers. Smoke, they knew, went up. Forcing it to travel horizontally and even downwards seemed like a violation of nature's laws. Ilara, however, was following her husband's diagrams. The sheer heat and velocity of the gases exiting the riser would push the exhaust through the system. As the smoke wound its way through the 100 feet of flue pipe buried within the cob, it would slowly cool, its thermal energy bleeding out and being absorbed by the tons of stone and clay. By the time the smoke finally exited the chimney on the far side of the cabin, it would be cool enough to hold a hand over, all its useful energy captured. While Ilara worked with this slow, meticulous precision, the rest of the valley was a hive of frantic, traditional activity. Silas and the other men were finishing their own cabins. The air rang with the sound of hammers striking nails and axes splitting the last of the seasoned wood. They worked quickly, confidently, using the methods they had always used. They installed their iron stoves, running the black pipes straight up through the ceiling. They chinked their logs, stuffed insulation around their window frames, and banked earth against their foundations. They were finishing their winter preparations, while Ilara, in their eyes, was still playing in the mud. Her son, Samuel, was her only companion in the work. He was too small to lift the heavy stones, but he could haul buckets of sand from the creek, gather dry grass, and hand his mother her tools. He didn't understand the diagrams or the theories, but he understood his mother's focus. He watched her work, her face a mask of concentration, and he felt the quiet importance of the task. Sometimes, when the loneliness pressed in, he would ask, "Mama, why don't we have a real stove, like Mr. Blackwood?" Ilara would stop her work, wipe a smudge of clay from his cheek, and say, "Because, my love, a real stove knows how to hold a secret. This one will hold the summer for us, all winter long." By late October, the mass was complete. It was a beautiful, sculptural thing, a long, low bench that curved gently along the wall, its surface smoothed to a fine, hard plaster. It dominated the small cabin, a silent, earthy presence. Ilara spent a week lighting tiny, careful fires inside it, just a handful of twigs at a time, to slowly cure the immense structure. The process was agonizingly slow, a test of patience. The other settlers were already burning their stoves for warmth during the increasingly cold nights. They saw the pathetic wisps of smoke from her chimney and shook their heads. She was falling further and further behind. The day came when the first true cold snap arrived. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in a single afternoon. Ilara built her first proper fire. She filled the small firebox with a few pieces of split wood, no more than she could carry in one arm, and lit it. The fire roared to life in the small chamber, a contained inferno. For an hour, the fire burned with a furious intensity, and then it was done. The wood was gone, reduced to a handful of white ash. She closed the heavy iron door, sealing the system. There was no heat, not yet. The surface of the bench was still cool to the touch. In Silas's cabin a mile away, the big iron stove was already radiating a fierce, direct heat, and he felt the familiar satisfaction of a job well done. He thought of the widow and her mud pile and felt a pang of genuine pity. She and the boy would be freezing tonight. But an hour later, something remarkable began to happen in Ilara's cabin. A gentle, pervasive warmth began to emanate from the cob bench. It was not the scorching heat of an iron stove. It was a deep, radiant warmth, like that of a sun-baked stone in the late afternoon. It was everywhere. There were no cold spots, no drafts. The floor was warm. The air was warm. The warmth seemed to come from the very bones of the house itself. Samuel, who had been huddled in a blanket, slowly unwrapped himself. He went to the bench and laid his hands on its surface. It was not hot enough to burn, just deeply, wonderfully warm. He curled up on it, a contented smile on his face, and soon fell asleep. Ilara sat in her rocking chair, a book in her lap, and felt the steady, gentle heat wrap around her like an embrace. She had used a tiny fraction of the wood Silas was burning, and her home was filled with a perfect, silent warmth that would last until the morning. The great storm arrived in the second week of December. They called it the White Death. It came not as snow at first, but as wind, a shrieking, relentless gale that clawed at the cabins and screamed down the newly built chimneys. The temperature plummeted. It dropped past 0, past 10 below, past 20 below, settling into a realm of cold that was no longer a number on a thermometer, but a physical, malevolent force. The air itself felt sharp enough to cut the lungs. Then the snow began, not in flakes, but as a horizontal, blinding torrent of ice particles that stung any exposed skin like 1,000 needles. The world outside vanished. There was no sky, no land, only the roaring, white chaos of the blizzard. The snow began to pile up, driven by the wind into massive drifts that buried fences, swallowed sheds, and climbed the walls of the cabins themselves. The sun was a forgotten memory. The days were a dim, gray twilight, and the nights were an absolute, howling blackness. For the settlers in the valley, their world shrank to the four walls of their homes, and those walls were failing them. Inside Silas Blackwood's cabin, the fight for survival was becoming desperate. The big iron stove, which had been a symbol of his preparedness, was now a tyrant. It devoured wood. He and his oldest son had to take turns feeding it, stuffing logs into its fiery mouth every half hour. The stove roared, its sides glowing, but the heat it produced was a lie. It blasted out in a 10-foot circle, creating a small island of scorching heat in a sea of bitter cold. To sit near it was to roast on one side and freeze on the other. If they moved away from the stove, the cold would sink into their bones instantly. The walls radiated a deep, penetrating chill. The frost on the inside of the logs was now a thick, white fur. His wife and younger children were bundled in their beds, buried under every blanket they possessed, their breath crystallizing in the air. The woodpile, which he had thought would last until February, was half gone in 3 days. A terrible calculus began in his mind. How much wood did they have left? How long would the storm last? What would they burn when the wood was gone? The furniture? The walls of the barn? The wind hammered at the cabin, and with every gust, it seemed to steal more of their precious, hard-won heat. The drafts were no longer like knives, they were like swords, cutting through their layers of clothing. The sound of the wind was a constant, maddening scream that frayed their nerves and amplified their fear. They were living in a fortress under siege, and the enemy was winning. It was the same story in every other cabin in the valley. The families were cold, they were frightened, and they were running out of fuel. They were trapped, each in their own little pocket of misery, all victims of the same flawed design. They had built their homes to fight the cold, but they had built them all wrong. They had invited a fiery beast into their homes, but the beast was wasteful and inefficient, and most of its strength went straight up the chimney, lost to the raging storm outside. In Ilara's cabin, there was stillness. The wind howled outside, a distant and irrelevant fury. The snow piled up against the walls, but inside it was not a threat. It was insulation. The deep cold of the outside air could not penetrate the thick logs, because the warmth inside was not fighting it. It was simply present. Twice a day, once in the early morning and once in the evening, Ilara would build a small, hot fire in the firebox. For an hour, the fire would crackle and roar, a brief and vibrant burst of energy. Then it would die down, and she would seal the door. The great earthen bench, the mud pile the others had mocked, did its silent work. It had absorbed the intense heat of that short fire, and now it released it slowly, steadily, into the small cabin. The entire mass was a single, gentle radiator. The surface was warm to the touch, and Samuel spent most of his days and nights sleeping on it, perfectly comfortable in just his day clothes. The warmth was even and constant. There were no drafts, because the interior and exterior wall temperatures were not drastically different. The air did not move. It was simply warm. Ilara and Samuel read books. They played checkers. They ate their meals at their small table in the middle of the room, far from the heater, and they were comfortable. Her woodpile, a modest stack of wood that the others would have burned in 2 days, was barely diminished. She had enough to last for months. The storm raged, but inside her small, foolishly built cabin, it was a peaceful, quiet afternoon. On the 4th day of the storm, Silas Blackwood made his last trip to the woodpile. There were only a few logs left, not enough to get them through the night. A cold, hard knot of fear tightened in his stomach. He had failed. His knowledge, his strength, his pride as a builder and a provider, it had all amounted to nothing against this cold. He looked at his wife's pale, drawn face, at his children shivering beneath the mounds of blankets. He had to do something. And then a thought surfaced, a thought he had dismissed 100 times as impossible foolishness. The widow, Ilara. He had to know. Was she frozen? Had her mud chimney collapsed and filled the cabin with smoke? Or worse? A grim sense of duty propelled him. If she and the boy were in trouble, he had to try to help them. It was a fool's errand to go out in this blizzard, but it was better than sitting here, waiting for the fire to die. He bundled himself in every layer of clothing he owned, wrapped a scarf over his face, and told his wife he was going to check on the widow. She pleaded with him not to go, but she saw the resolve in his eyes. The journey was a nightmare. The wind tore at him, trying to knock him from his feet. The snow was waist-deep in places, and he had to fight for every step. He could not see more than a few feet in front of him. He navigated by memory, by the feel of the land beneath the snow. It was only a mile, but it felt like 100. His beard froze solid. His eyelashes collected ice. The cold was a physical pain, a crushing weight that threatened to extinguish the life in him. Several times he thought of turning back, but the image of his freezing family pushed him forward. When he finally stumbled toward her cabin, he could barely see it through the swirling snow. It was a small, dark shape, half buried in a drift. There was no plume of smoke rising from the chimney. His heart sank. He had been right. The fire was out. They were gone. He staggered to the door, his limbs numb and clumsy, and pounded on it with his frozen fist. "Ilara!" he yelled, his voice swallowed by the wind. "Are you in there?" There was no answer. With a surge of desperate strength, he put his shoulder to the door and shoved. It swung inward, and he fell into the room, bringing a blast of wind and snow with him. He landed on his hands and knees on the floor, gasping for breath, the cold from his clothes spreading around him. He pushed the door shut against the storm and looked up, his eyes adjusting to the dim light. And then he felt it. It was the last thing in the world he expected. It was warmth, not the fierce, dry heat of an iron stove, but a gentle, pervasive warmth that seemed to rise from the floor and hang in the still air. He saw them then. Ilara was sitting in her rocking chair, a quilt over her lap, a book in her hands. Samuel was on the floor, playing with some carved wooden animals. Neither of them was bundled in heavy coats. They were dressed as if it were a cool autumn day. They looked up at him, startled by his violent entrance. There was no fire. There was no stove. There was only the large, silent earthen bench along the wall. Silas stared, his mind refusing to process what his senses were telling him. He pushed himself to his feet, swaying with exhaustion and disbelief. He took off a glove and held his bare hand out. The air was warm. He took a few steps further into the room, away from the door. It was still warm. He walked over to the mud bench and placed his hand on its surface. It was radiating a steady, deep heat. "How?" he whispered, the word a ragged puff of frozen air. "There's no fire." Ilara closed her book and set it aside. "The fire was this morning," she said calmly. "The bench is the stove now. It will be warm until tomorrow." Silas looked from her calm face to the contented child, to the impossible source of the heat. He saw the small, neat stack of wood by the wall, enough to fill a wheelbarrow perhaps, and then he thought of his own vanishing woodpile, the forest he had consumed for nothing. He thought of his shivering children. He thought of his own loud, certain pronouncements. He had called her a fool. He had laughed at her. He had warned her she would freeze. He was wrong. He was so profoundly, devastatingly wrong that the shame of it burned hotter than his own stove ever had. He did not say, "I told you so." She did not gloat. There was no triumph in her eyes, only a quiet compassion. She stood up and went to a small kettle that was sitting on a warmer spot on the bench's surface. "You look frozen through," she said. "Sit down. I'll make you some tea." He stumbled over to the bench, the source of all his confusion, and sat down. The warmth seeped into his frozen clothes, into his very bones. It was the most wonderful feeling he had ever known. He sat there, a giant of a man made small by his own ignorance, and let the widow he had pitied serve him a cup of hot tea in her warm, quiet, impossible home. He did not speak. He just sat and listened to the storm howl outside. A harmless beast now kept at bay, not by a raging fire, but by a mountain of mud and a woman's quiet wisdom. When the storm finally broke 2 days later, the sun emerged to a world transformed. The valley was buried under a deep, silent blanket of white. The silence was the first thing everyone noticed. The incessant scream of the wind was gone. From the cabins, people began to emerge, digging their way out, their faces pinched and pale from the long ordeal. The first priority was wood. The men immediately set out with saws and axes to replenish their depleted stores. But the second priority was to confirm the story Silas had brought back with him. He had returned to his own cabin that night, after the tea, with 2 of Ilara's logs under his arm, a gift, and a story that no one could quite believe. He had described the gentle, even heat, the lack of a fire, the comfort of her home. His wife had listened, her eyes wide with wonder. The tale spread as soon as the storm lifted. It went from cabin to cabin, a whispered rumor of a miracle. A mud pile that held the summer. A cabin with no stove that was warmer than any that had one. They came in ones and twos at first. They trudged through the deep snow to Ilara's cabin, their faces a mixture of skepticism and desperate hope. They knocked on her door, hesitant, almost shy. Ilara welcomed them all. She let them into her small, warm space and watched as they had the exact same reaction as Silas. They would stop just inside the door, a look of utter astonishment on their faces. They would feel the air, touch the bench, and stare at the tiny woodpile. They saw Samuel, healthy and warm, and they looked at their own children, who were pale and recovering from days of shivering. The laughter was gone. The mockery was gone. In their place was a profound, humbling silence. Silas returned, but this time he did not come as a rescuer or a critic. He came as a student. He stood before Ilara, his hat in his hands, his pride stripped away by the brutal honesty of the cold. "Ma'am," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I was a fool, a proud, ignorant fool. What I knew was wrong, and what you know, it saved you. It could save us all." He looked at the earthen bench, not as a pile of mud, but as a piece of profound engineering. "Teach me," he said. It was not a request. It was a plea. "Teach me how to build this." Ilara did not hesitate. She did not ask for payment or an apology. The knowledge was not hers to hoard. It was meant to be shared. It was the key to survival, and in this place, survival was a communal effort. She took a stick, and in the smooth snow outside her cabin door, she began to draw. She drew the firebox, the heat riser, the long, winding flue. She explained the principles her husband had taught her. She spoke of thermal mass, of how earth and stone could be a battery for heat. She explained why a small, hot fire was more efficient than a large, smoldering one. She described how to mix the cob, how to lay the stones, how to calculate the flue length to match the size of the space. Silas knelt in the snow beside her, a master builder listening with the focus of a raw apprentice. Other men from the valley gathered around, their faces intent, their skepticism replaced by a hungry curiosity. They asked questions, and Ilara answered them patiently. She explained that the system was not her invention, but an old idea, from a place where the winters were just as fierce. She took them inside and showed them the components, the clean outdoors, the simple chimney. She lit a small fire so they could see how it drew, how little smoke it produced. They watched, they learned, and they understood. They had been trying to fight the winter with a constant, roaring battle. Ilara had shown them how to survive it with a quiet, patient wisdom. That spring, the valley was filled with a new kind of construction. The sound of axes and saws was now joined by the rhythmic squelch and slap of people mixing cob. Under Silas's direction, guided by Ilara's drawings, the men of the valley began retrofitting their cabins. They tore out their inefficient iron stoves, selling them for scrap or other supplies. In their place, they began building the massive, gentle hearths of their new homes. They dug foundations, hauled stone, and mixed mountains of clay, sand, and straw. The work was hard and slow, but it was done with a communal spirit they hadn't felt before. They were not just building heaters, they were undoing a collective mistake. They were building a future where their children would not have to shiver through the winter. Silas was the most dedicated of them all. He worked tirelessly, moving from cabin to cabin, helping his neighbors, ensuring that every detail of the design was followed perfectly. And at every step, if he was unsure, he would walk to Ilara's cabin and ask. He never failed to give her the credit. "This is the widow's way," he would tell the others, and it's the right way. By the time the first frosts of autumn arrived, nearly every home in the valley had its own earthen hearth. They were all different, shaped to fit the space, some curving as benches, others rising as thick, warm walls. They became the center of family life, the warm, solid core around which everything revolved. The women would use their surfaces to dry herbs, proof bread, and warm blankets. The children would curl up on them to read and sleep. The men would rest their weary backs against them after a long day's work. The story of the valley that survived the White Death began to spread. Travelers passing through were astonished by the comfort of the cabins and the strange, sculptural heaters within them. They would ask about them, and the settlers would tell the story of the widow and her mud chimney. The tale was carried to other settlements, other territories. Men would travel to the valley to see the designs for themselves, and Silas, with Ilara's blessing, would teach them what he had learned. The idea spread, not through books or official channels, but from one person to another, a quiet revolution in survival. The widow's hearth, as it came to be known, became a legend on the frontier, a symbol of a better way to live in a hard land. Ilara never sought credit or praise. She lived her quiet life, raising her son, tending her garden, and watching the community she had inadvertently saved. Her triumph was not in being right, but in the sight of smoke rising from the chimneys of her neighbors only twice a day. Her reward was the quiet knowledge that the families in the valley were safe, that the children were warm. She had learned from her husband's books, but the valley had learned from the harsh teacher of winter, and from the humility of its most respected builder. Years later, as the valley grew into a proper town, the story endured. It became a lesson passed down from one generation to the next. It was a story about the danger of pride, of being so sure in the old ways that you refuse to see a new truth. And it was a story about the nature of wisdom, that it is often found not in the loudest voice or the strongest arm, but in quiet observation, in patient work, and in the courage to trust an idea that everyone else calls foolish. The greatest strength, the children were taught, was not in never being wrong, but in having the grace to admit when you were, and the humility to learn a better way. The legacy of the mud chimney was not just warmth, but wisdom.